Welcome back to Teen Story Share. This week we're continuing At the End of the World by Nadia Mikhail. If you missed the past 2 weeks of reading, those will be linked down below. Just a quick reminder, in this book, the main character, Aisha, is about to try to find her sister, who she has not seen in about 3 years. And we also meet her boyfriend, Walter, a stray cat named Fleabag, and just one little extra thing, the world is about to end in about less than 9 months. She overslept, which was strange. Before the announcement, everyone said it with a capital A quiet in their mouths. Aisha had been a 17-year-old student who deeply treasured sleeping late and whose mother shouted about breakfast to wake her up. Now, time was precious. She woke up early and faced the day and whatever would come with it. Still, today she overslept and awoke to Essa shaking her shoulder gently. "Bangun, sayang." The sunlight had made its relentless way through her window, and Aisha winced when she opened her eyes. The sun seemed brighter these days, brighter and so very tired all at once, like a final spurt of a sprint, like it knew this was the final stretch. "What time is it?" "1," Essa said. "Lunchtime." She went downstairs. Lunch was carrots from the garden and one of Mrs. Liu's chickens, freshly slaughtered and plucked and turned into korma. They ate quietly, but there was still something. Something had changed since yesterday, like the air was humming. Aisha had thought they would spend their last days in this little house. Or, to be entirely truthful, she hadn't really thought about it or talked about it with Essa. What with getting used to this strange pre-apocalyptic world. They still might spend their last days in this little house, but June, the name like a scab, like a scar, now hung in the air. She could be anywhere, and they were going to find her. Perhaps the air was humming with small adventure. Aisha was washing the dishes when Walter knocked on the door. 3 polite knocks, as always. Then he waited for someone to answer. Essa said, "I'll take care of the rest. Go answer the door." And Aisha gratefully stepped back, wringing her hands, and went outside. Walter smiled at her. He was wearing a shirt with a dog on it, faded blue and one of his favorites. He was wearing his sneakers that were falling apart, the ones Aisha hated. Aisha loved him immensely. That was why it spilled out of her, why she said, "We're going to find June." Her stomach was turning with it. "Walter," she said, "please come with us." Walter was a person of much deliberation. He loved many things in the world, like ice cream and cartoon animal t-shirts and choral documentaries and his trumpet. He jumped from interest to interest, devouring them all, and firmly not deciding on something silly like a single career. This also meant it took ages for him to decide things like what to eat for dinner, because he wanted to try everything he saw on the menu, or which playlist to listen to in the car, which meant in the end they didn't listen to more than 30 seconds of one song. Walter said, with no hesitation, "Okay." Her eyes must have been wide, because he said again, laughing, "Okay," and "Yes," and "Of course," and gathered her close into his arms. He smelled of his familiar woodsy cologne, something so safe and dependable. She closed her eyes in relief. "Aisha, I need my parents to come along," he said, mouth moving against her hair. "Of course," Aisha said into his warm, solid chest, feeling more than a little overwhelmed and more than a lot grateful. When he smiled, she could feel it. It felt like it vibrated throughout her, like it lit her up from the inside. "Will you come with me to ask them?" "Okay," Aisha said, feeling like she'd agree to anything he asked her right then. "Yes, of course." Walter's Parents, Part 1, 2 years and a month ago. The first time Aisha had met Robert Gahn and Elizabeth Jelani, she'd been slightly wary. Dating someone of a different race was not the easiest thing, at least not in Malaysia. It was a thing families still tended to think twice about because of the long, tense racial history wrapped into their nationhood, a place where religion figured heavily when 2 people of different races thought about marriage. It was worry wrapped up in fear, and Aisha knew that this was a volatile package. So, the first time Aisha had met Robert Gahn and Elizabeth Jelani, she'd been cautious. Walter had reassured her over and over again. "They're great, you know, for parents," had been one of his most frequent refrains, along with "You're wonderful and they'll love you," another favorite. He'd reminded her of this at the cinema, in the car, and on the phone, hopeful and earnest about it. Eventually, Aisha couldn't put it off any longer. Walter had said, "Yeah, maybe next time," very quietly, the last time Aisha suggested maybe another date for the first meeting, and his eyes had been cast down, lashes dark against his cheeks. Aisha hated herself a little bit for that. It was important to be brave if it meant she didn't have to see that look ever again. "Actually," she'd said, tomorrow's fine." Walter's smile, with its crooked canines, slowly spread. The next afternoon, Aisha had stepped cautiously into the compound of Walter's semi-detached house. Her little house had a small patch of grass in front and a couple of pots in the back, but Walter's had a garden, one with a mango tree and wild, soft grass. One time, madly passionate about rodent behavior for a month, he'd set up a maze for squirrels. The vestiges of this particular endeavor still lived on in a squirrel feeder by the porch. A white swing rocked lazily in the slight breeze. Elizabeth Jelani stepped out in a lavender sundress, shielding her eyes from the afternoon sun, and said to Walter, "Finally! Go spray down the car. It's too hot to think." To Aisha, she said, "Hello." "Hi, Auntie," Aisha said, very politely. Elizabeth Jelani smiled. She was small and slender with straight black hair, tied back and slightly crooked teeth, just like Walter's. She said, "It's so hot. Let him stay here and spray." She considered Aisha for a fleeting moment, but Aisha felt it, that quick flickering of her kind gaze. "We'll go inside and drink juice." Walter said, "Ugh," perfunctorily, pressed his arm against hers for a moment, and went. His mother and Aisha went inside and drank juice. Aisha had never been inside Walter's house before, but she supposed she shouldn't have been surprised that it was covered with pictures of Walter, their only child and beloved son. Everything was very tasteful, with cool colors highlighted by red Chinese New Year decorations that hadn't yet been taken down. There was a piano in the living room, a small set of gongs, an enkerumung near it, and fruits on every surface. They sat in the kitchen drinking orange juice, freshly squeezed only that morning, and Elizabeth asked very casual questions about school and her mother and her sister. Aisha stumbled over that last bit. June's departure had still been 11 months fresh at the time, and the anniversary of it was coming up. The question caught her by surprise. She moved away. Elizabeth said, "Oh, they grow up so fast," very quickly and easily, and moved on to a different topic. Then Robert Gahn appeared in the doorway. He was solidly built like Walter, and had Walter's soft, thick hair and strong eyebrows. "Orange juice today," he said. "Very healthy." He grinned at Aisha before getting a cup for himself. "Did you know we have 3 juice makers?" "They're blenders," Elizabeth said, sounding long-suffering but smiling. "Of course, that's what I said. Aisha, is it?" "Hi, Uncle," Aisha said very politely. "I hope Walter is watering the grass too," Robert said comfortably, coming to sit down beside his wife. "It's such a hot day. Everything's drying out." "So," and this was directed to Aisha, "what are you planning to study in university?" Aisha said, "Probably medicine, I think, if I get the grades. I don't know yet if I will." "That's fine," said Robert. "At least you have some idea. I didn't know what I was going to study in university, even after I'd finished studying it. Walter certainly doesn't." Elizabeth looked at him fondly. "Anang majag ka parangai niya. He already thinks meandering is fine." "Meandering is fine," Robert said. "All roads lead somewhere." He shook his head at Aisha, "Even when they're long and winding." Aisha had sat amid all this kindness, feeling a little out of place, a little unfamiliar. She then understood a little better how Walter had turned out the way he had. Walter's Parents, Part 2. The Present. Now Aisha stood outside Walter's semi-detached house, thinking that she was asking too much from these people who had made her feel so welcome for 2 years, despite all their worry. There were only a few months of their lives left, and she was asking them to join a hunt for her sister who had left voluntarily, who had taken steady steps away from her and not looked back. She thought of the expression on her mother's face, and of Walter, of how it was important to be brave for him. For these two people, she would try. Walter called, unlocking the gate. "Ma! Dad!" "What a nice surprise," Elizabeth said, opening their front door. "Walter, don't shout, the neighbors." Elizabeth's reaction to the world ending had been to transform their compound, already teeming with large oranges and lush mangoes and long bananas, into a proper food garden with bright tomatoes and smooth eggplant and abundant spinach. Chickens clucked furiously, contained in some netting in the back. She gave most of the food away to the neighborhood and didn't ask for much in return. Robert's reaction to the world ending had been to quit his engineering job immediately and help his wife with the garden. They sat down at the kitchen table. Elizabeth poured everyone a glass of mango juice. There was an expectant silence. The condensation from Aisha's glass dripped slowly onto the table. Walter's eyes were on her encouragingly. Has Walter told you about where my sister is?" "No, dear," said Elizabeth. "The only thing we know is, well, you said she moved away." "I wasn't going to tell something that wasn't mine to tell," said Walter. "She fought with my mum." This felt like scratching at new skin, the skin stinging with it. Walter's gaze was still on her. "Be brave." "We haven't heard from her since. We're going to find her. We think she might be in Malacca." Aisha watched Elizabeth and Robert exchange a glance. "Is Walter going with you?" Robert asked, his voice carefully neutral. "Only if you come too," Aisha said, and replayed this in her head. She hastily amended it like a request. We would really like you to come. It would be so nice. I think we really need your company. No pressure, of course, but we were hoping you would consider it. Of course, if it turns out she's not there, we'll go straight home." She looked down at her hands, trying to stop stumbling over her words. Saying it like that, it seemed even more ridiculous, asking these people to travel across the country with what little time they had left. Under the table, Walter squeezed her knee supportively, his fingers firm. Elizabeth and Robert exchanged another glance. Robert quirked an eyebrow, and Elizabeth gave a minuscule shrug of one slender shoulder. She got up to refill their glasses. "Well, that sounds great, Aisha," she said, setting the jug back down, sounding for all the world like an entire conversation had just passed between her and her husband. Aisha said, surprised and on reflex, "Really?" "We were planning to go for one last trip around the country anyway," Robert said, his thick eyebrows scrunched together kindly. "With one condition. We'll stop by a little place in Ipoh." He smiled at his wife. Walter looked at them both, eyes bright. Aisha heard his voice in her head. "They're great for parents." That fond tone of the offspring of a happy family. "A little place in Ipoh?" Walter was asking. "You mean—" "You've been there," Elizabeth said, brushing his hair out of his eyes. He sniffed and pressed it back down, grinning at her. "You probably don't remember." "You were busy sucking on your toes for most of your time there," Robert agreed. "We don't expect you to remember much." They turned toward Aisha, 3 anticipatory pairs of eyes awaiting her response. "Well, you don't have to," Walter said. He caught her gaze and held it. "We could go on our own and catch up to you." Aisha shook her head and smoothed out her skirt. She felt a little unfamiliar, a little out of place, a little taken aback by how easy it had all been, a little overwhelmingly grateful. "Ipoh sounds great," she said. She was sitting amid all this kindness. She did not know if she could ever repay it. All right, I hope you're enjoying the book so far. Next time we find out about Malacca, where June might be. Have a great weekend. See you again next time. Bye-bye.